Rituals. So today we're going to talk about why we create rituals, what's the purpose and function of them, and how do they vary across cultures. Nick and I go a deep dive into this subject in this video. So strap in and take a listen. All right, here we are. Back for the attack. Nick, my man, he's back.
How you doing, sir?
Under a rock for a while. No, I'm just kidding. You've been super busy.
Yeah, a little bit.
We got all kinds of cool stuff brewing. So rituals and superstitions. This came about from like one of our other conversations that was kind of offline. We were kind of discussing what is the point of superstitions and rituals and all that kind of thing. Now, of course, the word superstition has an inherent judgment attached to it naturally, so that tends to be the culture, a different culture attaching, saying that what you believe is a superstition, because the people who practice it don't think of it as a superstition, But it ties a lot into the idea of rituals. I wrote a paper a while back for the Journal of Analytical Psychology that was talking about the technology of ritual. They contacted me a few years ago. They were trying to do they were working on a special issue of how analytical psychology interfaces with technology. And I said, do you want to do anything along with this? And at the time, I was deep into my research for healing symbols in psychotherapy and my third book. And so I thought, well, there's just some way I can spin what I'm working on into that. And I did. And I was talking about how rituals are a kind of technology, if you take the definition in a sort of broad context, as a behavior that is geared towards a particular problem-solving issue, right? So that's a technology. And of course, humans have technology. All cultures have technologies of one sort or another, and there's animals that have technologies as well. Simple tool using is a type of technology. It's a cultural thing that you learn. And you could even argue that like hunting methods is a type of technology, and that so you would expand that. So if you look at it in a broad sense, then rituals are a type of technology because they have a goal. And usually the goal is to transition somebody from one type of social category into another. So, I mean, I don't know if that tracks with what you typically think of when someone mentions the word ritual. But like, what is your take on that?
Well, I was going to ask you, I know the conversation we had, I mentioned my grandmother at one point having a certain superstition about a child being born on a certain date, and then the mother stepping over a stick that was of a certain kind of wood. And that, she was describing this to me, and I know we were talking about it, but yeah, I like that idea of ritual and superstition being indicative of a level of kind of just like folk technology. Because as you were talking, I was thinking about, well, the symbolism of a certain superstition might have, some real world significance in terms of, let's say, danger. There's monsters in the forest. We're superstitious of this thing. Don't go in there because there is maybe danger or death, or, you could get hurt. So yeah, I definitely can see it that way. But what do you mean by like social categories?
Okay. Well, now the stuff you're talking about is of a different variety than the social category element of ritual. So we should maybe do some definitions here. So like a superstition, if we remove the kind of pejorative quality that it's attached to it, is really a belief. So it's a folk belief based on the presumed connection between X behavior and Y outcome of some kind. And those are like little nuggets of belief that can get built up into making meaning. And that's the function of those. Rituals are these long processes that are involved in transitioning somebody from one social category to another, which would be things like a single person to a married person. Right? We know that ritual, right? Any of us who's married has gone through that ritual, and we are no longer single people anymore. So we're a different category. Or coming of age rituals, which is the thing most people talk about when they're talking about rituals. But there's a bunch of other ones around the world. There's cultures that have elaborate rituals to transition you from a childless couple to a couple with a baby. Or, of course, death, right? Death, that's the big one at the end, right? The exclamation point. And that transitions not only the living person into the dead person, which we think of in our sort of mechanistic Western world as a biological process. But that's not the typical case. And around the world, there's a much more process going on. It's not just you're alive, you're dead, like Stephen Wright says. Everyone dies instantaneously. No, that's not how it works. You die, and then your spirit is in this kind of liminal state. And during that time, you're in a dangerous state, right? You're not quite sure what happened to you. You're confused. You can wreak havoc magically and all this kind of stuff until you transition to your final resting place, whatever that is. So that's that. But it also transitions the bereaved, and this is kind of under the radar since it's not as explicit, to a person who had a loved one to a person who has a loved one in a different way. They are not physically present anymore, but they're present in other ways. So those are those categories.
Got it.
So that's what I mean. So a ritual is a more complex process. And there's a lot of anthropologists have defined it a lot of different ways. It's one of those nebulous things that people debate about what exactly a ritual is. And there's a book that was a really influential book by a guy named Roy Rappaport, who wrote a book called Ritual and the Religion and the Making of Humanity. It was his magnum opus. He wrote at the end of his career. Very, very powerful, interesting book. I learned a lot from that and incorporated that into my research. But he defines a ritual as a set of activities that are invented by somebody else that you perform in order to accomplish some kind of task, whatever it is, transitioning category. And there are a number of features of it that separate it from other things that sometimes get labeled as rituals. Like, I remember when I was doing a conference in Ireland one time, I was talking about this, and we just kind of went around the room, like, what kind of rituals does everybody do? And a lot of what they described were really just habits. Like, every morning I get up and I have my cup of coffee. That's not a ritual. There's no higher purpose involved. There's no symbolism. There's none of that. You're not transitioning anything to anything else. It's just a habit, right? You just get up with your coffee. So it's not a ritual. It's ritualized, you could say. It's kind of ritualistic. It also doesn't have the characteristic of having been invented by somebody else. That's a key feature to it, which is what distinguishes a ritual from, say, an obsession in someone with severe OCD. They invent all of the stuff that they're doing. Now, there's a ritual character to it, certainly. There's been lots of researchers that have noted that, starting with Freud and moving on, saying, isn't it interesting how this looks so much like these rituals? Of course, Freud, being his lovable self, said, well, it's just evidence that it's all a bunch of baloney, But that's Freud. But yeah, it still doesn't quite qualify, because you need the collective element. And you need to be, I'm participating in this thing that I didn't create myself. That tiny little thing is actually huge. Yeah.
Well, as a avid coffee drinker, I'm offended.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah, I mean, in terms of like OCD and something, like that, the repetition and the compulsion to keep on doing it, whereas a socially significant ritual that is, it's something that's, all right, well, with OCD, they're doing it over and over and over again, and there's the transition between the need to do it and the slight alleviation of their symptoms or what they're feeling
Mhm.
It's really not fulfilling. They just keep
No.
doing it. It's not fulfilling a need.
Right.
And you could call that ritualistic, but I think what you're talking about is the socially significant rituals that we have cross-culturally.
Yeah.
Embedded in them are these like almost mass transitions, these
Mhm.
social transitions, going from one place, going through the barrier, and then being somewhere else.
Yes.
And
There's those kinds of rituals which tend to be one-shot deals. So you go through it once and you've done the thing. But there's also another kind which is more or less involved in trying to maintain and continue the order of the society. So that would be something like going to church every Sunday.
right.
Right. So my little world, I do that for myself to maintain order, to maintain, make sure I'm still on the right track. And the underlying belief in those kinds of rituals, which are more repetitive, are that they tend to be less bombastic and image rich. They tend to be more didactic and more kind of mundane, but repetitive. And the repetitiveness is what makes them resonant. Like you do it enough times, it sticks. Whereas the one-shot deal types of rituals, they stick because they're so vivid and they're so unforgettable. But their purposes are slightly different. In the first kind, the imagistic kind, those are designed to make the big transitions in your life. The example I often give, because of my own experience, is military, basic training in the military is designed to transition you from a civilian to a military member. And it is highly effective. 100%? No, nothing's 100%. But when you finish that, you tend to be pretty all in and with the idea that I am now a big part, I'm a small part of this big organization with a mission, etc. And they don't do it, they do it in a lot of ways that borrows from rituals around the world. And I'm sure that this is probably partly by design, but I think partly the tradition of this probably carried over from previous centuries. But anyway, the other kind, which some scholars call the doctrinal mode, is the things where like repeating verses of the Quran, for example, or mantras, stuff like that, more repetitive, like going to church every Sunday, that kind of thing. So the idea behind those is that the world is in continuous state of disorder and chaos, and that you have to continually update and bring things together to keep the world okay. That's kind of the idea behind that. And world being loosely defined is my own kind of subjective world.
Mm.
Yeah. So that's kind of the purpose behind that.
So let's say, for instance, the culture is recognizing a young boy's transition into manhood or a young girl's transition into womanhood. Mm-hmm. There will be these kind of ritualistic practices to recognize they're going into this stage of life. Mm-hmm. And admittance into that stage of life the ritual there is so necessary, because not only does it add to cultural cohesion, but it also adds to the very structure and fabric of them being able to adapt further, them being able to survive further, them being able to recognize, oh, okay, this is, I mean, maybe it's unconscious, but to some degree, they're recognizing certain biological processes through cultural ritual in order for them to go forward.
Well, yeah, and what rituals are essentially information creating processes. What I mean by that is the biological development process from child into adult is messy, it's variable, it's ambiguous, it's all over the place. And a culture such as we create, very complex and involved cultures, it I think is a technology that developed to help the members of that culture sort out who is who. If you're in the child role, I behave one way towards you. Well, you're an adult, I need to behave adult towards you. So it helps to sort out all of the ambivalence and the ambiguity, to have a ritual that says, okay, maybe it's variable, maybe it's all over the place, but we're going to skip all that and say, did you go through the ritual or not?
Mm.
Okay. So that's the power of ritual. It's very powerful because it takes these ambiguous and nebulous concepts and makes them into concrete either ors. An example I usually use here is one that's very familiar to most people in the West, which would be the marriage ritual. And there are aspects of this within that structure. It's one of the few rituals we still do, and we'll get to that later, is when it comes to technology, we've traded material technology for ritual technology. We suck at ritual technology compared to ancient cultures or even, non-Western cultures, apart from a couple of subcultures. In the kind of general culture, we don't have much of this ability. But nevertheless, there are a few remaining things that we still do. One of them, of course, being the ritual of marriage. And the thing about marriage is it's a commitment. And part of that commitment is that you have to say, I do, right? Okay. Well, you could say, well, what if maybe they don't really mean it? And of course, that's possible. But it doesn't matter, because I don't give a rat's ass if you don't mean it. You said it. You can't unsay it. Okay, you can't say I do and I don't do at the same time. You have to pick one. Mm-hmm. So that's what it does. It forces you into that either or category. It's like, I don't care what's going on in your little skull. You said I do, therefore you went through the ritual. Same thing with the ring. That's another aspect of the ring, is you can either wear the ring or you cannot wear the ring. You can't do both at the same time. Right? So taking off the ring now acquires this very intense symbolic meaning that cannot be faked. Okay. So the fundamental principle here is when humans evolved complex symbolic communication ability, it came with a number of huge advantages and some disadvantages. Just like everything else in nature, it's a trade-off. So the advantage is that we can convey complex information to each other, and that facilitates all kinds of survival benefits. But we can also convey complex misinformation to each other, right? So how do we sort out the wheat from the chaff? Ritual is one way in which humans have figured out how to get around that problem, that drawback of the way that we communicate with each other. Because I could communicate lies and falsehoods. I might even be ambivalent myself about how I feel about something. And so whatever I communicate to you is going to be a gamish of stuff that's hard to follow, right? So what does a ritual do? It says, well, you either do the thing or you don't do the thing, and then you're committed one way or the other. And you can think whatever you want, but you did the thing. The Rappaport uses the example of the rumbum tree for the marrying tribe that he studied, as Australian tribe. That tribe had this process of either going to war or staying at home and staying out of wars to raise their pigs. They're that level of society. They're subsistence farmers, pastoral farmers. So they grew crops, but they also mostly raised pigs. That was the majority of their subsistence. So once you started running out of pigs, you needed to quit going to war and you need to raise more pigs, right? So logically, there needed to be some way for the tribe to decide when they should be at war and when they should not be at war. Okay. So there's a ritual that they would do, which has to do with this tree that was a part of the tribe, that it was near any of the particular villages. And once they decided to go through this ritual, everybody in the whole tribe had to touch the rumbum tree and declare that there was an end to hostilities. Okay, so from a typical Western point of view, you look at that and you go like, well, what the hell does that matter, right? Who cares? They can touch the tree and not mean it. Yeah, but they can't touch the tree. They can't touch the tree and not touch the tree. That's what they can't do. So it resolves the ambiguity and the ambivalence. If you choose not to touch the tree, you're making a nonverbal statement to the rest of the tribe that you can't fake. And if you come back later and say, well, I know I touched the tree, but I didn't mean it, they're going to say, you touched the tree. I don't care what you mean and what you don't mean. Especially becomes much more powerful once you attach a spiritual and magical significance to this, so that the stakes are higher.
Mm.
You know, right? So if I'm in a culture and I accept the belief in spirits and magic and that kind of thing, if I touch it and I don't mean it, I might suffer some kind of bad luck.
Yeah.
So I'm even more, in line with that. I'm going to be more apt to, do that. So it fosters cohesion. It fosters the creation of meaning out of chaos.
Yeah.
And so you can see how that works. See? Same thing for the coming of age. So let me ask you this, right? When I was doing research for this, and it's easy to come across coming of age rites, because that's one thing that anthropologists have been grumbling about for years in the West, is that we don't have anything equivalent. Like some tribes, for example, particularly warrior tribes that have a lot of warfare, the rites of passage that you have to go through to become a warrior are intense, and they last a long time, and they get weeks sometimes, and they're extremely grueling and brutal and punishing. Okay. Nevertheless, that never stops armchair philosophers from saying, well, we've got rites of passage in our culture where, you get your driver's license, right? Or you graduate from high school. And I'm like, bruh, seriously, no. Right? Or if you look at ancient cultures, right? The Germanic tribes, you had to dive into a pit and wrestle an aurochs to the ground, which is like a giant bovine with these huge horns.
Right.
Right? Okay. There's some African tribes where you had to go out and single-handedly kill an elephant with a pointed stick. Okay. Getting a driver's license does not compare to that. I'm sorry. But the point I'm trying to make here is the technology for ritual and the psychological technology that involves, in order to transition me from child to warrior, is not an insignificant thing. It's not just hocus pocus and voodoo and mumbo jumbo. There's a lot of thought that goes into this, and it may be consciously aware. Like they may be literally attempting to affect the minds of the people that they're developing these rituals for. I'm sure the level of intelligence of Homo sapiens hasn't changed in 200,000 years. So there's probably people that think that way. And I don't mean not just level of intelligence, but different ways of thinking about things. It doesn't matter what culture you're in, I don't think. And so I'm sure some of them were like that, but others were just going by gut instinct and saying, if I go through this, I'm going to remember that. I'm going to be a stronger fighter, a hunter, better, whatever it is, right? Or I'll be more ready for the rigors of childbirth in the case of women, for example.
Right.
Because that's no small process.
No,
that's a big deal. So the point I'm making then is that you're taking something that's ambiguous and difficult to define and nebulous and forcing it into a rigorous category that is then recognized by everyone else in the social group. Now, if I'm going through that, another person, a very important person who recognizes it is me. Mm-hmm. So not only do other people treat me differently, I treat myself differently. Oh, I'm an adult now. I better start adulting, But I do remember reading some papers, editorials and things saying that we can just say that the transitioning out of high school is our rite of passage. What do you think of that?
No, I disagree. I mean, I think a rite of passage into what? And like the
question.
A rite of passage into what? I mean, I don't want to come off as too negative, but I know that, for some, they believe that, college or university is just an infantile extension of really another 4 years of high school. Like it's not really just an introduction to adulthood. Now, as you were talking, I was thinking to myself, well, yeah, like if we just look at graduating high school, or if we just look at getting your driver's license as a ritual, like, oh, you're an adult now, is there really any effectual baggage to that? I mean, I definitely think there is, right? But maybe not to the extent like you were talking about in terms of rites of passage into manhood, or rites of passage into womanhood, rites of passage into being a parent, all of that. And
we do
then,
have baby showers, like some
right,
people
yeah,
still do those,
gender
it's just
roles.
a type of ritual.
Yeah.
It's not very systematized, and it's not very ritualistic in the sense that um, typically rituals have certain qualities to them. They tend to be very image rich and image heavy. And by, I don't mean just visually, but also olfactory and sound and all of it. Some of them are physical too, as well. Like they have this, before you do the ritual, you basically exhaust yourself with singing and dancing for hours around the fire, for example. So things like that. The words that are spoken tend to be stylized. They tend to use archaic language. They tend to be spoken louder and more clearly, as if shouting them to the heavens and to the gods or whatever. There's characteristics of rituals that anthropologists have categorized. And so any given ritual that you're going to look at under this microscope will measure high or low on this category, you know. And so I agree with you completely that, yeah, getting a driver's license, that's a piece of this. But I mean, our society is so complicated that just having a driver's license is nowhere near enough to signify that you are a full-blown adult.
Right.
And in fact, I would argue that we don't have any idea what a full-blown adult really means.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So it's part of the problem is the complexity of our culture. It's just so ridiculous and constantly changing. Rituals take time to gel over generations. Not too long. I think typically 2 or 3 generations, and you can get one solidified, according to historical analysis. And a lot of times, particularly in non-literate cultures, they'll a ritual that's only about 2 or 3 generations old will acquire the characteristic of this is what has been done since the dawn of time. Why? Because that carries a lot of weight. Right? If I don't know any better and I'm hearing that, I'm like, oh, this is serious, right? And so, and to me, I'm looking at that, and some people might look at that and go, well, that's deception and it's all this kind of stuff. I'm like, but what is it doing? Mm-hmm. Right? If I treat it as it's as if this has been going on since the dawn of time.
Yeah.
I can continue to have that effect on me psychologically. So, yeah, powerful for that.
It adds a level of homeostasis that I think is repeated from generation to generation. When you have, this is coming from somebody that, I mean, Western culture is definitely, in my opinion, probably it's deprived itself in terms of the need for a deeper understanding of ritual and why it's important. And I wonder, is it because probably because we haven't lost touch with those emotions, the affect and the need for ritual. We just believe that it isn't necessarily needed anymore, right? Or that there aren't certain things that connect us culturally.
Some scholars think that it has to do with our own particular history that is post-Enlightenment, post-Protestant Reformation related. And that I think that's definitely a piece of it. Like we were saying earlier, I think part of the problem is the rapid changing and complexity of the culture too. It makes it hard for rituals to catch up with, okay, now this is what this means. Because it's going to change in five years. And then what are we going to do, right? But there is a pervasive attitude that is, I think we've inherited from the Enlightenment and from the Protestant Reformation. Even though we're not, I guess you could say there's still a large number of people who are Protestants in the West. And even anti-ritual thought is not unique to that group either. But that was a big part of the Reformation, which is let's break away from these old rituals that don't have any meaning. It's just going through the motions. It doesn't really mean anything. And just get down to sola scriptura and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of history that you could get into this with. But at the end of the day, the idea is that rituals are meaningless and empty. Whereas before, in prior centuries, they carried huge amounts of meaning and weight. And in some subgroups, of course, they still carry that. Communion, for example, in the Catholic Church. And um, that's a ritual.
Yeah.
Right. And you're literally consuming the body of Christ when you're doing that in a way that cannot be faked. You're ingesting it into your body. Okay, that's pretty powerful stuff if you're a believer in that. If you negate it all, though, and say it doesn't mean anything, it's all a bunch of hokum, then you're not going to get anything out of that. And I think you're right that just kind of the zeitgeist is that for the most part, it's all a bunch of hocus pocus and doesn't have any real meaning. So that means that we're losing the ability to avail ourselves of that technological skill or advancement. Yeah. And we've sacrificed it. We haven't been able to figure out what to replace it with.
I've noticed myself that there is a lot more whether they want to call it ritual or not, there's a lot more out there that is available for people online in terms of like signing up for a certain type of weekend or workshop or this or that and the other. That look at the schedules of these events, they're very ritualistic, right?
Yes, they are.
And I think they're craving stuff like that. And I think you brought up a good point in terms of the zeitgeist, because in the West now, if there's a consistent questioning about who or what we are and what makes us who we are. And because of that lack of cohesion, how can any ritual stick to the wall? Because, well, nothing means anything and nothing matters. And there's no differentiation and everything's just kind of this entropic soup, right? Yeah. Instead of it being like solidified. So
anything can mean anything.
Exactly.
Which is another way of saying nothing means anything.
Exactly.
That's true. Now there is, and I think those like retreats and, all of these zillions of different cults popping up here and there as well. It's another bit of evidence to suggest that there's a hunger for that. And you mentioned something that's super important, and that's we don't know who we are. Okay. Identity problem. Couldn't agree more. Now, and a lot of people identify that. They notice that. But what I don't hear too many people talking about is, what do we do about it? Right? Okay. So how do we figure it out? How do we do this? And honestly, most often the answer I hear to this is some version of, you just need to navel gaze more and look deep within yourself and blah, blah, blah. All right. Now, there's value in that. Absolutely. But it's not sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient to get what you want, which is an identity. And identity is crafted by relations to things outside of you. So all of the navel gazing in the world won't help this aspect of identity formation. Who am I to everyone else? Well, and if you'll notice, rituals are perfectly designed to do that very thing, which is the reason why they still have a very ritual heavy basic training in the military. They want you to feel strongly that you have a military identity. And the reason being that if you believe in what you do, you're going to be a better fighter than somebody who doesn't believe what they're going to do. I've actually heard war vets tell me this. If I'm fighting a mission I believe in, I'm twice as effective combat wise than if I don't. If I don't believe in what I'm doing, I might as well not be there. Well, of course, the military, the upper echelons, they know this. Yeah. And they want to do this. So what do? Well, the basic training process follows the classic Van Gennep tripartite rites of passage structure. You have a separation at the beginning where they break you off of your prior social category and they strip you down of all the identifiers of that, which is why you get the haircut and you have to wear the uniform and everybody looks the same. All markings of your individuality are removed. And, in a society like ours, that's a big deal where everybody has to express their individuality and, be a special snowflake all the time. Well, in the military, they're not going to put up with that crap, right? Because it's not conducive to anything except chaos. And everybody is an individual society unto themselves. That's not going to work. So they continue to do this. Now, this is an ancient technique in as far back as we can look, particularly in environments where it's going to be life or death, like hunting and warfare. This separation period can last 4 weeks. It does in the military still. In the Army, it's 8 weeks. Air Force is 6 weeks. I think Marines is 12 weeks.
No.
It just depends on which branch you're in. Either way, they separate you out. They strip away all your identifiers. They lump you together with a group of recruits. They will even go out of their way to dress you in clothing that hides your gender, if there are mixed genders within the group. That's commonplace around the world. Because even that's an identifier, and you don't get that. Because once you get separated, you're then in the liminal space. In the liminal space, you're being restructured. You're being taught the sacred narratives. You're being taught the secrets of the gods. And in the military, that translates into what are the missions. And we're going to tell you about some of the great campaigns. And especially in officer training, which I've been through that too, they tell you about the great decisions of the various, this, that, and the other. Or they teach you about the founding fathers, right, which has a mythic character to it now in America. And then only after you've gone through enough of that, you go to the third phase, which is the reincorporation phase. And that is the important point about all this is these are not just abstract ideas. If you're separated, it's not just a social category that you're being separated from. They also physically separate you. They put you in a different physical space because the physical space represents the psychological social space. That's where the concreteness comes in. So the great strength of ritual is that it takes the abstract and the divine and the nebulous and the magical, and it brings it down to concrete physical reality that you can hold in your hand. The reincorporation is going to be a literal reincorporation with what? The graduation ceremony, the graduation feast. You've got your nice uniform with the new rank and all the stuff put on it now, and the dress, et cetera. You go through the ceremony. It's not like high school, right? You can't just decide you don't want to show up to the graduation and get your diploma. No. If you either go there or you don't graduate, son, and we're going to send you right through again, 8 more weeks. That's how it operates. That's how important it is. It's expensive for them to do that. But you got to do it, or else you lose the structure. It all falls apart. Another thing about this, the uniform itself is an expression of identity. It's also a concrete expression of what you have done. Okay, so in other cultures, like especially with like warlike hunter-gatherer cultures, this is done through scarification or tattoos. Why? Because they're non-lethal, 1. 2, you won't forget it because it's painful as hell. 3, it can't be faked, right? It's right there on your skin and it can't be removed. So if I'm facing off against a warrior and they've got all this stuff all over them, that's a nonverbal communication to me that I'm dealing with a badass and I better watch it. Right? Right. And I know it and he knows it or she, right? If it's a female warrior. Either way. And so now we don't do that. We don't go that far, although a lot of military members get tattoos when they finish. Just saying. A lot of them, though, a lot of that energy is put into the uniform. Now, if you go on YouTube and you type in stolen valor videos, a bunch of videos will pop up of people calling other people out in public settings wearing the uniform incorrectly, or they've got patches on there that are like, dude, there's no way, or it's just messed up. And, if you were to guess, like, how pissed off do you think these people are?
Yeah.
Way up here. Why? It's just clothing, right? It's just meaningless, material. It doesn't have any inherent value, blah, blah, blah. You've heard all that stuff. Yep. Bullshit.
Yeah.
Bullshit. It means something. And they have a right to be angry about that because they're making a nonverbal social statement of identity that they haven't earned. And having been through that myself, even to the degree that I have as non-combat, and I didn't get bombed or anything like that. But nevertheless, I don't want somebody out there, pretending like they've gotten that, and having not done it, you know.
Right. Right.
That's just not right. That's not cool. It cheapens those people that have, right? Because when everything means anything, then nothing means anything.
Exactly.
Right. And so those symbols that they have on their uniforms become meaningless because they get diluted down by people who are using them incorrectly. So there's a definite lesson to be learned in all that.
Hmm.
Now, that was a rant. I'm sorry.
No, you're right. I mean, it does cheapen it, right? And it does make it less. I can imagine that having gone through the pain and struggle and building the bonds of through such a ritual, you'd again, like to see somebody else claim that they've been through that transition, claim that they've done that, but they haven't. I would be upset. I think anybody would be upset. And I think it lends more credence to the fact that these rituals are important.
Yes, they are. They are important. And well, you know, something that might be a little closer to home for you is the graduate school process. You know, this is a strong argument not to skip the graduation ceremony. And in medical school, we had a white coat ceremony, which was at the beginning of medical school. Everybody got their white coat and they made a big deal out of it. You put it on, right? Because the white coat is itself an emblem and a symbol of the medical profession. So once you put that on, you are adopting the role of a healer in training, of course. Then you go through 4 years and then you've got residency on top of that. But the point is that when you graduate medical school, though, you get the diploma, you get the robe, you get all that stuff. And now, do I know any more after the ceremony than I knew before the ceremony? No. Right. But it still matters because it's a concrete event, a point in time and space at which I transition from one category to another.
Yeah.
And even if I don't, and most doctors, once they graduate medical school, go through imposter syndrome for a while. And they're like, should I really be writing these scripts? You know, I'm just a regular guy, right? You're not anymore. And you honestly, you go back to that ceremony mentally and say, you know what? Somebody thought I deserved to get this, right? Maybe they were mistaken, but here I am, you know, so maybe if I don't believe necessarily in what I'm doing or, you know, believe in my ability, you know, somebody did.
Yeah.
So it's that outside of you piece that's so important to this too. And you can't do that without a culture. You can't do that in an atomized culture, I should say. All right. In a market society where everybody can just be whatever, because it just doesn't carry any weight. It's me proclaiming that I'm whatever I want to be.
Right.
You know?
So our institutions should be the ones to uphold the need for those rituals to be taken seriously instead of basically saying that, yeah, it's easy. Anybody can like it's not to say that anybody can't do it, but it's more along the lines of saying like, no, this should take work and effort. And it should probably be a struggle in order for you to be qualified in order to do this. And like, I hear that a lot. I hear a lot of critiques about institution and especially like going through school and this, that, and the other, which I think are absolutely valid. But on the other hand, the best of what they do should be ritualistic in terms of, no, there is a certain, again, it's like that in between space, that Bardo space, right? You're going from here to here. In order to get here, you have to go through the process. Right. And the best of what that process looks like is based off of deep underlying structures of what makes human beings and nature, and so on and so forth.
I can't restructure my identity into something else until I break down the previous one. Yeah, that's what the liminal space is there to do. It's got to be long enough to essentially allow the old one to die. Yeah, and the new one to develop. If it's just 5 minutes, it's not going to cut it. Psychologically, it's just not going to work. Yeah.
And do you think that there needs to be a balance between the imagistic and the doctrinal?
So in my research on this, the guys that came up with this, Laidlaw and I'm forgetting his name now, but it's the guy that worked with him. I'll probably remember it in 20 minutes. Anyway, they identify that these two types of rituals have different functions. And the imagistic ones are for those one-time transitions. They're designed to be unforgettable. That's part of the reason why the warrior ones are so brutal and painful is for that effect. But I think also they make them grueling in order to develop and foster resilience. If you're a warrior, you're going to have to be resilient. You need to be tough. And there is some of that to a degree in military training, which is designed to make you tough. Mm-hmm. Army Ranger training, for example, involves slowly allowing you less and less food and sleep while you are still expected to perform at a very high level. And part of that is it's multifactorial. On one end, if you go through all that, you'll never forget it. And you'll say, hey, I did that thing that was really hard. Most people wouldn't choose to do that. That must mean that, I mean, you've basically proven to yourself that you can. So it gives you confidence, which adds up to a lot. But also it means too that I'm firmly in that social category of having done that. And I am now a warrior or ranger or whatever it is. Because I can't forget that I went through that process. It's just too vivid. Okay. I don't know if you can hear that, but
a little bit. It's all good.
Okay. Anyway, so that and you know, if I'm ever in a situation down the road where I'm sleep deprived and I'm, you know, hungry and all that stuff, I can harken back to that experience that was in a controlled environment. Mm. Now that's more about the type of category that you're moving into, but it still plays a part of the meaning of it. Mm. Right. And so they're going to be brutal and intense. But they tend to be very vivid, and like look at the pageantry that goes into a lot of weddings. Now you can always argue, well, I mean, doesn't seem to do much good, right? The divorce rate's like 50-something%, you know, but that's the ritual can't do all that work on its own. I'm sorry. You also have a society, you have to have a society that is kind of helps support that. And we don't. We have a lot of centrifugal forces acting on social groups in our culture. That's another conversation. But I don't know. I think I've just completely derailed the conversation.
No. I think you're right. Well, I think you're right. I think, well, it begs the question, like, do you take the ritual seriously in terms of divorce rates, you know, and what other factors are going into that marriage as well? Yeah. You know,
cultures that have the highest, you know, or the lowest, I should say, divorce rates, as far as I understand it, tend to be ones where the marriages are arranged.
Yep.
So I don't know exactly what that means, but you know, my guess is that it's just it's a baked in feature of the society, and therefore it's supported from that angle, right? You're in it, you're in the system, you're just going along with the way it works. Mm-hmm. Right. And I've had some residents that came from cultures that practiced that were in arranged marriages themselves, which I'm very grateful to have that experience from those different cultures. Because if, you know, taking it seriously and looking at this like, this is another way of doing this that's radically different from how we do it in this country, I'm curious. I want to know more about it, you know. Is it better or worse, you know, or, that's probably impossible to answer, but at least it gives you a feel for it. And one of the things that a couple of them have mentioned is that it's just easier, right? You know, you get all that Sturm und Drang that goes on in middle school about finding the one true love, and that doesn't seem to end like ever, you know, unless you happen to get married and, you know, you decide that that's the person for you. They don't have all that drama. You know, it's like, it's going to be this person, you know, just learn to love them. And they even have separate categories for people who get married for love. They call them love marriages. It's kind of telling. They need a whole separate category for that kind of arrangement. And in some cases, they are looked at with suspicion. Love marriage. You're like, what do people know? They don't know anything about that, you know.
Right.
So, I mean, one of the downside, of course, it means that you a lot of times are going to end up forced into one direction or another that you may not necessarily want to go. So that's the trade-off. But I think the issue is that many Westerners don't think that there's a trade-off. They think that our way is just a better way, period. And I'm not convinced of that.
Yeah.
I think our way is our way, and it comes with its pluses and its minuses. And if we don't acknowledge that, we're going to be riding blind.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same thing with rituals.
Yeah, it's an acceptance of limitations to a certain extent.
Yeah.
You know, and structure. And
so in a society like ours, which is very anti-ritual, we therefore buy, as a part of that, a vulnerability to the things that ritual tend to help people with, which is building identity. If I don't have anything that tells me I'm in one category or another, I can't really build a social identity very easily, except through declarations with lots of emotion behind them. And that's about it. Expressions of sincere belief, you know, which is always subject to scrutiny. Well, do you really believe? Are you a poser? Are you a real metalhead? Right? All that silly crap that middle schoolers do, that's silly crap that Homo sapiens does. They just started in middle school and it never ends. And what are they doing in middle school? They're forming cliques.
Yeah.
And they're forming these outside external indicators of what group they belong to. They're trying to build a social identity. They can't help it. That's what we do as humans. Because if we give them nothing to work with, that's what they do. They're going to make it up. Yeah. So, but you know, we all remember going through that in school.
Oh, for sure.
You know, and it still goes on. Like online, it's a complete vicious swab of nonsense. Oh, half of it's aimed at that kind of stuff. Like, which group are you? And now we've got political affiliation that dives into that, right? Well, I'm a right wing this, or I'm a left wing, you know, and therefore I have to believe A, B, and C. It's bonkers. Yeah. It's bonkers because it's people making stuff up rather than a process like a ritual that has stood the test of time, something that has withstood. And I think our culture just changes too rapidly, at least right now anyway, for that to work like it has in the past. Mm. And maybe there's going to be no end to that. I don't know. But there we are.
Here we are.
Here we are. You know.
Yeah. Well, I wonder to what degree too that a lot of the outsourcing or the kind of sublimating of certain instincts towards group identity, tribalism, this, that, and the other. I wonder to what degree that was ameliorated or given a healthier outlet in previous rituals, right? Mm. And now that because we're so absent in it, that we are now driving all that energy into things that are more superficial, but potentially more I don't want to say harmful, right? So
well, some of it's extremely toxic.
Yeah.
I think this is precisely behind stuff like flat earthers and neo-Nazis and a lot of the political discourse that goes on is so vitriolic. Mm. Yeah, it's us versus them. And you have to defend it with that level of ridiculous intensity if you don't have anything else to help you feel that it's real. And what rituals do is they reassure you. Mm. Because there's a part of the psyche that I think is very good at bullshit detecting.
Yeah.
And you know, and so if I don't do the thing, the physical, actual thing that can't be faked, that bullshit detector is going to go off, and you're always going to be doubting yourself and always wondering if I'm really a member of this category or not. And so if our ritual technology has eroded over the centuries, which I think it has compared to other cultures, then people are going to be grasping it with all that much more intensity because the desire is still there. Yeah. You know, and so there's all of this toxic tribalism out there. And unfortunately, the discourse on that is that tribalism in general is bad. and then we need to eliminate all of it. And I don't think that's going to work. I think that's a great idea, and it's the wrong species.
Yeah.
So we all crave it because it's just woven into our DNA. We can't help it.
Yeah.
We've got to figure out a healthy way to express that.
Yeah. Well, again, bringing it back to culturally significant values, rituals that are cultural examples of things that are much deeper than just political parties. Than just,
the stuff that changes with the wind.
Philosophical ideas that are just, that mean nothing, right?
Right. They're just airy. Philosophizing. Changes with, again, does it change with the wind? Yeah. Well, and then middle schoolers use clothing and music and fads because they don't know any better, right? And to them, it's stuff that's been around forever because it's been around 5 years, right? So, but it's because they don't have anything else to work with. If in other cultures, children the exact same age are absorbing the cultures or the symbols of that culture that have been around and have endured. And does that mean they get locked into rigid, categories sometimes or roles? Yeah, that's the downside. But we need to start recognizing that there's a downside to getting rid of all that stuff too.
Yeah.
There's no easy answers here. Is the main point I've been trying to make with this kind of stuff, And so even things like the superstitions, which started this whole conversation, I think they have a root in that desire to make meaning out of something real and concrete and physical, right? So I don't want to step on a crack, right, on a sidewalk, because that means that I'm risking harm to my mother, right? As the old line goes. Yeah. And do you think I skipped the cracks and the lines on the sidewalk? You better believe I did. Because it's not that I really believed it would do anything. It's just the thought, right? How could you do that? Don't you love your mom? Right? Of course I did. And so I was like, well, I'm not stepping on that. I don't want anybody to even think that I would do that.
Right.
So it turns a physical act into a significant inner truth or a representation thereof. I remember reading a paper where they were talking about in the area, the modern Brittany, in rural cultures there, there's a strong belief that when people die, there are certain things that happen prior to that signify that it's going to happen, like a bird crowing or, random stuff that they attribute meaning to. And it becomes part of the narrative. Oh yes, before that person died, I heard, a certain owl hooting at midnight or whatever. So now you could easily look at that and it's just a bunch of ho-hum, but what are they really doing, right? I always ask that question, like, what does this belief do? What it does is it provides a narrative that says this was inevitable. This was God's work. There was no way you could change that death. And again, your typical Westerner is going to look at that and, oh gosh, it's so fatalistic and it's so depressing and pessimistic. But is it? No, not really, because you're looking at that and saying, there's forces beyond me. That means I don't have to try to take responsibility for every fracking thing that happens, which is real. It's real. And we have such a tendency to this, inflation of responsibility in our culture. It's nuts.
Yep.
And so but those narratives force you to think this is outside of that. It's not. It's weird, as they would say in Beowulf, right? It's God saying this shall happen, and courage will save you if it's God's will. Courage will save you. So Beowulf puts it, right? And source of all wisdom is, of course, Beowulf. Yeah, naturally. I return to the well many times.
Right.
Tons of ritualism in that poem. Speaking of that. Attending to the customs and the courtesies and all that stuff. See those other videos.
There's 5 of them?
I think we did 5.
Yeah.
The whole series on that poem.
Wow.
The definitive analysis.
Right. Yeah.
In my not so humble opinion. So there we are.
Good stuff.
That's what we got for you. So some thoughts about ritualism and superstition. Anybody out there, you want to learn more about this stuff, let us know.
Yeah.
Because this is a subject that we could go on and on about. There's so much here.
It's literally once you pull one string, it's just like so many strings that you can just leads in. Yeah, I mean, we could talk about it for hours. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me, sir. I appreciate it, and we'll definitely
glad to have you back
next week. Yeah, I'm glad to be back.
Yep. All right, gang. We'll have more of Nick's input and more stuff on the way.
All right, guys. See you later.
Bye.